In this video, we're going to use Unity and Bolt Visual Scripting to add the ability to pick up items, move them, and even swap them with different items in other slots. Let's begin.
Shall we play a game?
This is part 6 of my complete inventory series, and in order to complete this tutorial, you need to have first completed the previous tutorials in order. If this is the first video that you're seeing in this series, then simply click the card in the top right to return to the start. If you're the type of person who prefers a written tutorial to a video format, I've posted a link on my Patreon page that will give you a step-by-step guide on how to complete each of these steps, which is free for everyone to use. If you enjoy these tutorials and would like to help support my channel, be sure to choose your level of support on my Patreon page while you're there. As I stated in the showcase video, if you want the system but don't really care about building it, as my way of saying thank you to my top supporters, I've made the project files downloadable. Not only is my complete inventory system included to these supporters, but my complete 2D player controller as well, which, by the way, includes a simple enemy AI. With that out of the way, let's get started with this build. Before we get started, I want to add a little disclaimer for this part of the tutorial series. This is where things are going to start getting a lot more complicated, and there's a lot that we're going to need to cover in today's tutorial. So before you get started, go grab yourself a snack because you're going to be here a while. In order to be able to pick up and drop items in our UI panel, we're going to need to think critically about what needs to happen when we click on an item in our inventory. So far, we've only been adding items to our panel, and we followed a certain order of events to be able to accomplish this. To pick items up, we need to not only cover the same steps in reverse, we also need a place to put these items when they're in our hand. That's where the Object Manager comes into play. I actually already have an Object Manager canvas set up, but that is exactly what you're going to need to reflect an item that you pick up and place in your hands. So the way you can do that is just right-click, go to UI, and then go to Canvas. Click Canvas, rename that Object Manager Canvas, or OM Canvas. And then what we're going to do is we're going to grab an item game object in our inventory here. So go to item slot, right-click item, hit copy. Then what we're going to do is close our inventory canvas, right-click our OM canvas, and hit paste. And it should throw it right down here at the bottom. We're going to rename that game object Object Manager. And then we're going to drag that and place that underneath our OM canvas. And what that's going to do is it's actually going to give us an image item and as well as the amount. So we already had that amount set, and the good news is we're not going to have to adjust the amount at all. But our Object Manager canvas, the first thing that we need to do as we scroll down here is we need to change the macro from item, or what is the inventory item that we have there, as inventory item flow macro. We need to change that to Object Manager. And if we do not take this step, if we do not do this now, any changes that we make in the Object Manager macro is going to reflect in every single item for our inventory. We don't want that. So just right-click in our panel. As a matter of fact, you might go to Inventory System, go to your macros, and create a new folder called Object Manager. So you can do 6-Object Manager, and we can right-click here, create a new Bolt flow macro, and just name that Object Manager, and then give that to the Object Manager right here by clicking this little button, selecting a flow macro Object Manager, and closing that out. Because we're actually going to be referencing the Object Manager a lot in our game, it's better to set it up as an app variable than to try to reference it by tag. In fact, most of the stuff I'm using in this entire build is not using find with tag. There are a couple of things that we do in order to manipulate some of the functions that we have that we use for tag, but we need this Object Manager set as an application variable. And the way that we do that is just go to our app variables under our variables tab and create a new app variable, call it Object Manager. You're going to set that to a game object, and you'll notice here that I'm using the item template again, and the reason why is it doesn't matter what we have in this slot, because as we set up the singleton principle where we set the application variable to this game object whenever the game starts, it will change this, but we need something to be in this slot so that it registers as a game object and doesn't revert back to null. There are actually a couple more things that we're going to need to do with our Object Manager game object before we start getting into any of the code that we're going to write today. We need to add these 3 variables to the Object Manager game object. And if you copied your item game object over, you should already have some variables. So just rename the item slot or slot list, whatever it is, the AOT list that you had. Name it pick slot list. And you're going to need a second AOT list, which I'll explain why in just a minute. Name that pick slot list 2, and then our Boolean is going to be object picked, and leave that set to false. The last thing you need to do is just make sure that this raycast target right here is unchecked. If you left that checked, then whenever you pick up an item, you'll never be able to click through it in order to grab another game object. And so we don't need that. Just uncheck raycast target, and then we're ready to proceed. In order to better explain why we actually need 2 slot lists on our object manager game object, I've gone ahead and set up this little slideshow that should help us. In Unity, the way that lists work is that you can remove items from a list as long as it's not the last item. If you did that, well, then you would need the clear list function. So if you try to take the last object, it's going to say, well, that object can't be found. And that's just the way that lists work. So what we're going to do is just when we pick up a stack, so assuming nothing's in our hand, we pick up a stack of items. And right now we're talking about stacks, but in a later tutorial, we'll talk about how to move individual items. We are going to add all of the items in the slot list, which is the object variable AOT list that we have on our item game object. We're going to add all of those items to the object manager pick slot list. Then we're going to clear that list. That's pretty simple. So we have now items in our hand. Well, we can place those in an empty slot by simply just taking the pick slot list, adding it to the slot list, and then clearing this list. Well, what happens whenever we actually try to swap items? So assuming we have something in our hand and we are now picking up another object. Well, what we're going to do then is we're going to take all of the items in our slot list and put them in pick slot list 2. Then we're going to clear this list. We're going to add the items that were in our hand to slot list and clear this list. And then we're going to need to take all of the items in the pick slot list 2, which are item in hand 2. So if you consider you have a left hand and a right hand, you're having to switch hands so you pick up everything and then place it in that list. That's essentially what's taking place here. We're taking all of these items in pick slot list 2 and putting them in pick slot list. And then we're going to clear that list. For this build, we are going to be using our left and right mouse buttons. We're not going to be using our middle button so much, but if you wanted to be able to use your middle button whenever you click on a game object, this is how you would actually set that up. What we're going to need is we're going to need to create a new bolt flow macro. Right click, create bolt flow macro, rename that pointer click. I place this under my macros folder under the other folder here, and this is what that macro actually looks like. So what we're going to do is we're going to get a pointer click on ourselves. We're going to check the pointer event data get button, and we're going to see if it's equal with our input button of pointer event data left, right, or middle. If it's just going to go first to the left, and it's going to check the right, and if it's not the right, well, then it'd have to be the middle. I have an output here with left, right, and middle on the flow output. Now, you may be wondering, why don't we use the on mouse input or the on mouse down input? Well, let me see if I can pull that up. On mouse input here, you have the ability to select left, right, and middle. Well, the reason we're not using this unit is because we need it to only register a mouse click on that game object itself. So you're going to need to go ahead and set this up in order to be able to use the left, right, and middle buttons whenever we click on those individual game objects. And we're going to need to go ahead and set this up because we will be using this actually a lot in this build. Okay, we're actually going to need to set up another flow macro in that others folder. We're going to set one up called item same. And what this is going to be doing is to check the item in one list and see if it's the same with the first item in another list. And so on our input here, we have a control input called input, and then we have 2 value inputs. One's called list 1, this is an AOT list, and the other is called list 2, which is also an AOT list. So we're going to plug those lists in here, and it's going to see if those 2 game objects are the same, and then it's going to come back with a true and false variable. We're actually going to be using this quite a bit, so go ahead and set this up, and then we'll proceed. Under that macros other folder, you're also going to need a new flow macro called add each to list. So just create a new one, rename it add each to list. And this is actually very simple. We're going to be using this quite a bit. The input, it has a control input called input, and then it has 2 value inputs called from list to list. and those are both AOT lists. And what we're doing here is we're running all of the game objects from the first list into a for each loop. It's the first time we've actually seen this unit, but it's grabbing all of those items, and then it's adding all of those items to the second list. Then we're going to run that into an exit node on our output. The next thing we're going to need to do is going under our macros folder 3 inventory item folder. We're going to need to create a new flow macro called slot to OM, or slot to object manager. And this is the overview here. It's kind of hard to get all this on one screen, so I'll just take each one of these segments in order. We're going to run an input into our add to each list superunit that we just made. And the first list that we're going to be taking from is our slot list on that individual game object. Then we're going to add those to the pick slot list from our object manager application variable. Then we clear slot list 1. Then we're going to turn the image of that game object off in the slot, and we're also going to take its child, which is the amount text. We're going to disable that as well. Then we're going to undo what we've already done when we added those items, and we're doing it in reverse order. We're setting the picked bool on our object manager, which we actually set that variable up, and I'll show you how we use that in just a minute. We're setting that to true so that when we do an update, it will update the picture and update the amount on our object manager. Then we're going to make our slot list empty, so or not our slot list, but our slot. So on the parent game object item slot, we need to check the isFull variable boolean to off so that we can add an item to that slot later on. And we're also going to have to do the same thing with capped. So if it comes back as a capped variable, remember, we're not going to be able to add anything to that list as well. Then we run that into an output. Okay, next, under your macros folder, under the inventory item folder, we need to add yet another flow macro called OM to slot, or object manager to slot. In other words, from our hand to the slot. And this is really only going to trigger when there's actually something already in the slot. So what we need to do, there's a little bit to this macro. I'm going to give you the overview there. You can pause that on your screen and build that and continue when you're ready. I'll try to explain this by section. So basically, when our input comes into our flow here, we're going to run it through a branch, and we don't want to add more items than our capped amount is going to allow us to do. We only want to add so many items until we cap out, and then we want to keep the rest of them in our hand. And so what we're doing here in order to get that to work is we're checking the item cap on the item in the pick slot list, because it's the same as to what we're adding. We would never make it this far unless it were the same item. So we're just checking it from the pick slot list, and we're saying, is the item cap greater or equal to the amount of items in our hand plus the items in our slot? And if it is greater or equal to, then what it's going to do is it's going to fire this top for loop, and it's going to just stop at however many items our pick slot list actually has. And if it isn't, then what it's going to do is it's going to be the difference between our item cap minus our slot list. So these two for loops do exactly the same thing, with exception of where they need to stop. And so this branch is controlling which one of these for loops is actually firing. As it comes out, you'll notice that both of these bodies run into the same branch. We're checking to see if there's only one item left in our pick slot list. And it can do this not only when we only have one item, but let's say they have 3 items. It's going to add the first item down here. It's going to add the second item down here. But when it realizes that there's only one item left in our hand, it's going to trigger this one up here. And the reason why we're doing that is because, remember, I told you cannot take the last item out of a list without it actually triggering an error. And this is our way around that, essentially. That this down here, we're adding this list items one at a time. We're removing those items. And when we get down to one item, we're going to fire this up here, where we are adding the item. We are setting the object picked variable on our object manager game object to true, so that when we update it, it will clear the picture and clear the number on our object manager. And then we are clearing the list. So we're not removing the item, we're clearing the list because there was only one item left. We're adding that item, clearing the list, and then we're going to send both of these for loops exit nodes out to the output node right here that I've called exit on the control output. If you remember that slideshow that I showed you where we actually have 3 lists working at once, this is what we're going to need to do. Go ahead and make another flow macro, call it item swap. This is actually what we're doing in that picture. So what we're going to do is we're going to have an input come in, and assuming we have an item in our hand and we're trying to swap it out, what we're going to do is add all of the items that are in that list that we're trying to click on to pick slot list 2 on our object manager, and then we're going to clear the slot list, and then we're going to come over here and then we're going to add all of those items from our picked slot list 1, which actually doesn't have a number on it, it's just called picked slot list, and we're going to add that to our slot. And the way we do that is just by triggering that custom event and running those items into that argument. Now, if you remember, on our parent object on the item, so for example, our item slot here, we have this custom event called item add. That's what we're actually triggering. We're just going to add it in through this system. The reason we're doing that is because it already updates the picture and it already updates the amount. So on our item swap here, we have add items from picked slot list, which is picked 1 in this scenario here, and we're adding that to our slot list, and then we clear the pick slot list. Last thing we do is we add all of the items from pick slot list 2 to pick slot list, and then we clear the pick slot list right here, and then we run that into an output node on our output. Once you get all that done, we're actually going to put every single one of those units inside the relocate item flow macro. Now, this is the last one on our item, and then we will move to other places that we need to make one in. So on our relocate item flow macro, under our inventory item folder, we're going to create this flow macro. So there's a little bit to this one, but as you can see, this is not so big because we've actually been making super units that we're going to make use of here. So as our input comes in, we're going to check, is there an object in our hand? In other words, is there object picked variable true? If there's nothing in our hand, then what we're going to do is we're just going to pick up that object. So the slot list to object manager. So we're just picking up that item, and then we run a custom event called OM update. I'll show you where that is actually triggered here in just a minute, but we're just going to pick those items up. If when we come in, we notice that there is something in our hand, then we're going to check, is that object capped? Because if it's capped, well, then we just need to swap out those items. If it's not capped, then we're going to check if it's the same item. If the items in the slot list are the same as the item in the pick slot list on the object manager. If it is the same item, then we're going to start adding those items individually from object manager to slot, and then we're going to run a custom event trigger called update stack. I'll show you where we actually make that change here in just a minute, and then we update the items in the object manager. If whenever we come in and it is not capped and it's not the same, well, then we just go into objects or the item swap here, run that into an update, and all of that, once it's done, goes into a flow output. Once we get the relocate item super unit made, we're going to run our pointer click super unit macro that we made with a left, right, and middle. We're just going to run the left click into relocate item. Now, you remember in our relocate item, you had this update stack. Let me show you where we're actually going to trigger that. Under our add items super unit, we are going to create, actually we're going to do that right here. This trigger, this custom event is being triggered right here, update stack. And we're going to have to add another flow input here called update stack. So under our control inputs, just do one called update stack. And the reason we're doing that is because we're not adding any items. We just wanted to check the number and see if it's more than 1. If it's greater than 1, then it's going to have to come up here and turn the text on. If it's not greater than 1, well, then we're going to have to turn that off. So both of those go into the output, and this should be set up whenever we add items to our list. But we still need to set a couple more things up. When we click on a game object, we actually need to be able to put that into empty slots. And so the way that we're going to do that is by going to our item slot game object. We're going to have to set up a new super unit called item to empty. And so under our macros folder, we're going to go to number 2 folder, the item slot folder. We're going to create a new flow macro, item to empty. And this is what this one looks like. So basically what we're going to be doing is we're going to check to see if an object is in our hand. If an object's in our hand, well, then we're going to go and we're going to add all of those items in our hand to the item add custom event. In other words, putting it into our system on that slot. And then we're going to clear the pick slot list, set the object picked Boolean, the object variable Boolean to false, and then we're going to run an update on our object manager. So once we get that set, we're going to go back to our item slot, grab our pointer click, super unit here, left, just run it into that is full object variable, and if it's not full, then we're going to add those items to empty. We are actually going to be using the true node at a later date. So just go ahead and set this up on your item slot, and I'll go ahead and show you the last macro that we need to set up, which is our object manager. On our object manager flow macro, we're actually going to have to set up this super unit right here, and basically what this is doing, let me just take this one at a time. We already had that singleton principle set up so that the object manager is being set to that application variable. When we pick up an item, this right here is going to check is object picked. So we had that variable on our game object, the object manager called object picked. The reason we have that is to make sure that we can run an update and put that object on our mouse position. So wherever you move the mouse, that little picture and the text will follow wherever your mouse goes. So we need that update running into the set position, get mouse position. Then what we're going to do is we're going to run the OM update custom event that we've triggered several times saying, hey, update the system. We have set that object picked variable to true or false in other places that we had our macros built. If it's true, if an object is picked up, then we're going to set the image to enabled, and then we're going to do a couple of things here. We're going to set the sprite image to the sprite renderer get image of the first item in the pick slot list. So an object is there. We're going to check the image. We're going to set the image on the object manager itself to whatever that picture was. And then what we're going to do is we're going to count the items in our pick slot list. If it's greater than 1, well, then we need to set the text as well, which is what this unit right over here is doing. If it's not greater than 1, it's going to come here and it's going to check whether it's 0, and it's going to either turn off the number if it's 1 or if it's 0. And you may be wondering, why are we using 2 here? Well, because we actually have some other things that are going to need to happen whenever it is actually 0, but we will set that up at a later date. We don't actually need that right at the moment. So once you get this unit set up, you should be able to now test your system. And you should notice that you can add items, you can pick up items, relocate them, move them around, and you can also swap items. So we can pick it up, drop it, pick it up, drop it. If you want, let me show you one thing real quick. If you want the size of the images whenever you pick them up to be bigger or smaller, you can actually go to your object manager here. You can actually go to the whole canvas if you wanted to. Actually, you can't do that under that one. You have to do it under Object Manager, and you just kind of set the scale. We can set that to, let's say, 0.5 on the X and the Y and the Z, and you should notice that whenever you pick these items up, they will actually be smaller or bigger, just depending on however you mess with those variables. So if I pick it up now, you should notice that it makes it a lot smaller. I don't know, that's personal preference. You might like it to go smaller so that you can see where it's actually going. I don't know, that's completely up to you, but you should actually now have a system that works where you can relocate items. Okay, if you followed this tutorial closely, you should now be able to pick up and relocate items as well as swap items in a slot list. What if, however, you want to take your items and throw them back into the world? Well, that's what we're actually going to begin covering in the next tutorial. I hope this video was helpful for you and that you survived. You should now have the capability to move your stuff around and arrange it. I'm looking forward to the next tutorial, but for now, just let me say thanks for joining me. My name is Megahertz, and I'm out.